The wheelchair was already moving toward the edge. Evelyn Carter had not yet understood what was happening. She felt the cold wind first, that sharp, biting October wind that rose from the gorge and cut straight through her thin wool shawl like it was nothing at all. Then she felt the speed, slow at first, then faster. The rocky ground beneath the wheels was uneven, and the chair bumped and tilted as it rolled forward, and she reached instinctively for the armrests, her frail fingers gripping the cold metal. And then she heard his voice. Adrian leaned close from behind, his lips near her ear, his voice stripped of every warmth she had ever believed was real. "Once you're gone," he said quietly, "everything becomes mine." The words did not fully reach her before the push came. One firm, deliberate shove, and the world fell away beneath her. Her scream tore across the cliff face and down through the gorge and out across the cold mountain valley like something wounded and impossible. The wheelchair went over the lip of the overlook, and for one terrifying moment, Evelyn Carter was falling through empty air with 60 feet of rock and cold fury between her and the river below. Adrian stood at the edge and watched. He did not move. He did not call out. He simply stood there in the gray October light with his hands at his sides and his face perfectly composed. To any passing stranger, he might have looked like a man in quiet shock. He was not. He was a man who had waited 3 long years for a single moment, and the moment had finally come. What Adrian did not know, what he could not have accounted for in any of his careful, cold calculations, was that he had not come to Blackstone Cliff alone. He had never come anywhere alone. Rex had always been there. Raven Hollow was a mountain town in the truest sense, small and quiet and wrapped in pine, the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked and where the seasons changed slowly and with great ceremony. Evelyn Carter had lived there most of her life. She had inherited a modest textile company from her father and spent 30 years building it into something that employed nearly 200 people across 3 counties. She had never moved away, never chased anything grander than what she already had. The people of Raven Hollow were her people, and she took that seriously. She was also sick, had been for some time, a condition that had weakened her legs, then stolen them from her entirely, leaving her dependent on the wheelchair she hated, but accepted with the quiet grace that defined everything about her. She did not complain. She adapted. She continued showing up to town meetings and charity events and Sunday morning services, Rex walking slowly and steadily beside her chair, his amber eyes scanning the room with a calm and quiet authority. Rex had come to her 7 years ago. He had been young then, all energy and curiosity, and she had laughed at his enthusiasm and his enormous paws. But something in him had settled almost immediately around Evelyn, as though he recognized in her a steadiness that matched something deep inside himself. He became her shadow, her constant, her one companion who never needed anything explained. When the illness progressed, he adapted with her. When she moved to the wheelchair, he learned the pace of it. He slept at the foot of her bed. He laid his head in her lap during the long, quiet evenings. He watched the door when strangers came. He watched Adrian most of all. There had always been something in Adrian that Rex could not settle around. He could not name it the way a person might. He simply felt it, a low and persistent unease that lived in the air around the man, something that never fully resolved no matter how many months passed. Evelyn had noticed Rex's reluctance and chalked it up to the natural adjustment of a bonded dog to a new presence in the household. She had not looked deeper than that. She had trusted Adrian. She had loved him, or believed she had. On that Tuesday afternoon, when Adrian suggested the drive to Blackstone Cliff, Rex was in the back seat with his nose pressed to the window crack, reading the cold mountain air with slow and focused attention. When they stopped and Adrian began unloading the wheelchair from the back of the vehicle, Rex slipped out through the rear door, which had not latched completely. He did not bark or draw attention to himself. He moved quietly into the pine trees above the overlook and followed at a distance, watching. He watched Adrian push the chair toward the edge. He watched the angle of the man's shoulders change. He heard Evelyn scream. And something inside Rex that had been coiled and waiting for 7 years finally released. He came off the higher ground at a full run, covering the rocky terrain in seconds, his paws barely seeming to touch the earth. Adrian had no warning. He heard nothing. He felt only the impact. 100 pounds of muscle driving into him from behind and slamming him hard onto the rocky ground of the overlook. The breath left Adrian's body in a single violent rush. Rex stood over him immediately, front paws planted on the man's chest, his teeth bared, and his growl rolling out from somewhere so deep it seemed to come from the mountain itself. His amber eyes were locked on Adrian's face with an intensity that left no room for misunderstanding. Adrian did not move, could not move. The confidence that had carried him through 3 years of calculation and patience dissolved completely in the presence of that growl, those teeth, those eyes. "Easy," Adrian managed, his voice a thin and trembling thing. "Easy, boy." Rex did not ease. But then something shifted. Rex's ears turned. His head moved toward the cliff edge. He released Adrian with one final thunderous bark of warning and sprinted to the overlook, dropping his front paws to the edge and looking down into the gorge below. What he saw there was something that no plan and no calculation had accounted for. Partway down the cliff face, perhaps 30 feet below the lip of the overlook, a dead tree grew from a deep crack in the rock. Its branches stretched outward over the gorge, gnarled and gray, and in those branches the wheelchair had become tangled on its way down, and Evelyn, cold and shaking and bleeding from a cut above her temple, had managed to wrap both arms around the largest branch and hold on. She was alive, but the branch was bending. "Rex!" she called upward, her voice thin and terrified. "Rex, please, help me!" He barked, not once, not twice. He barked with everything inside him, long and frantic and furious, and the sound rolled down through the gorge and bounced off the rock faces and traveled out along the canyon road below with a clarity that cut through engine noise and wind and distance alike. Several miles down the mountain, 6 riders from the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club were working their way through the canyon pass. They were not young men. Most of them were veterans, men who had carried the particular weight that combat leaves behind, and who had found in each other's company a brotherhood that asked no questions and required no explanation. They rode together most weekends through the fall, through these same mountain roads, for no reason more complicated than that the mountains were beautiful and the silence between engines was good for certain kinds of thinking. The rider at the front of the group raised his fist and slowed. The others followed without question. "You hear that?" he said, pulling off his helmet. They listened. The barking came again, high and desperate and unmistakably urgent. "That's not a dog that found a squirrel," one of the men said quietly. They moved, up the rocky fire trail, engines low, until the overlook came into view. What they found there stopped every one of them in a single breath. A man lying on the ground near the cliff edge, and standing over him, a German shepherd who had not stopped barking since he first spotted them on the road below. And at the edge of the overlook, when the first rider looked over the side, a woman clinging to a tree above 60 feet of open air and roaring white water. "Call it in," he said immediately to the man beside him. "Right now." Two of the riders unstrapped climbing ropes from their saddlebags. A third positioned himself beside Adrian, who had not moved from the ground, who did not attempt to move. Rex circled nearby, his eyes tracking Adrian without pause, his growl a quiet and constant presence. The descent was careful and slow and frightening. The rock face was damp with cold, and the branches of the dead tree groaned under the additional movement. Small stones broke free and fell silently into the water below. One of the bikers, a broad-shouldered man with gray at his temples and the steady hands of someone who had navigated worse, worked his way down to Evelyn's level and looped a rope around her with quiet and practiced care. "I've got you," he said, close to her ear. "You can let go of the branch now. I've got you." "I can't," she whispered. "I'm afraid." "I know," he said, "but you're not alone anymore. I promise you that." She let go. The branch cracked apart 2 seconds later and fell into the river below without a trace. But Evelyn was already held, already being raised slowly and carefully back up the cliff face, while the man below guided and the man above pulled, and the rope held exactly as it was meant to. When her hands touched the solid rock of the overlook, and the rescue team that had arrived behind the bikers wrapped her in blankets and steadied her, she could not speak. She simply wept. Long, shaking, total weeping that came from somewhere beyond fear and beyond gratitude and beyond any word that exists for surviving something that was designed to end you. And then Rex was there. He pressed himself against her legs and pushed his head up into her hands, and she folded over him, both arms around his neck, her face buried in the warm fur behind his ears. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The rescue workers stood back. The bikers stood back. Even the wind seemed to drop. Rex let out a long, slow breath, as if he had been holding it since the moment she went over the edge. Adrian was in handcuffs before the ambulance arrived. He said nothing during the arrest. There was nothing left to say. The story had already written itself in rope burns and tire tracks and the testimony of 6 witnesses who had arrived on motorcycles because a dog had refused to stop crying for help. Later, wrapped in a hospital blanket with a bandage above her temple and Rex pressed firmly against her side, Evelyn gave her statement to the officers. She answered every question clearly and without bitterness, though her voice broke once near the end when she said his name. Rex did not leave her side for a single moment. He never would. The people of Raven Hollow would carry that story for a long time. They would tell it at the diner and at the Sunday service and on the front porches of old houses where the mountain evenings came down slow and purple through the trees. They would tell it because it mattered, because it reminded them of something they needed reminding of. That loyalty is not a feeling, it is a decision made quietly every single day to stay. That courage does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives on 4 paws through the pine trees, and sometimes it pulls up on a mountain road in leather jackets with climbing ropes and steady hands. But it arrives. When it is most needed, it arrives. And that greed, no matter how carefully constructed, no matter how long planned, cannot survive the moment a loyal heart decides it has seen enough. Rex was never trained for what he did that day. He was simply a dog who loved one woman with everything he had. And when the moment came, that love was enough, more than enough. It was everything. What this story teaches us. This story carries real and lasting value beyond its emotional power. First, it is a powerful lesson in recognizing the warning signs of financial exploitation and coercive relationships, particularly among older and vulnerable adults, reminding families to stay attentive to those they love. Second, it demonstrates the documented and scientifically supported bond between humans and dogs, and the extraordinary protective instincts that loyal animals carry. Third, it honors the spirit of community and selfless intervention. Ordinary people, in this case a group of veterans riding together, choosing without hesitation to act when a stranger needed help. Fourth, it teaches that evil rarely survives the presence of a single honest witness. And finally, it reminds every viewer that true loyalty, the kind that asks nothing in return, remains one of the most powerful forces in the human experience. These are lessons worth passing on. If this story reached something inside you today, please subscribe to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that loyalty is real, that courage still lives in quiet places, and that love, when it is genuine, will find a way to protect what it treasures. We will see you in the next story. Until then, be kind to the ones who walk beside you.